All right, so if we recap the morning today, our morning focused a lot on domestic mineral security. So for those of you who weren't with us this morning, we started with a keynote fireside with Jared Agan. And Jared really spelled out the White House's vision for minerals, the progress they've achieved this past year, and where they are headed. We then turned to a panel on domestic mineral security, where we talked a little bit about permitting, we talked about financing, we talked about how to make projects more bankable here at home in the United States. We then had another discussion looking at the role of copper security. So looking at how we're going to meet, copper is deeply synonymous with economic growth, and it's a very different commodity to the rare earths. We heard from Matt at MP Materials about the MP story and what the role of, government intervention has been there and what their permanent magnet manufacturing is. We then started to move international. You heard just before lunch from Representative Ami Bera about some of the efforts from House Foreign Affairs Committee to rethink about things like mineral security partnership and the DFC reauthorization, which I'm sure we'll hear more about today or now. So now I want to take you further down the international lane. Minerals this year, we kind of took a page out of China's playbook. And what that really means is China for the last 30 or 40 years strategically began using its foreign policy toolkit to secure minerals from around the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. Even here in the United States and certainly Australia, to bring those minerals back home for domestic processing and manufacturing. The United States this year, as we said earlier, minerals diplomacy became deeply synonymous with our foreign policy. And we saw this from the start of the administration when it came to Ukraine, and we saw that expand out, whether it was DRC or Saudi Arabia, Australia, Malaysia, Thailand. We've seen it feature in conversations in Latin America. So this afternoon panel starts to think about minerals diplomacy and as an idea, right? And what we're here to think about is what are the tools in our toolkit and how do we better use them to meet those ambitions? So I'm delighted to be joined, I tell you this every panel, by four of my favorite friends. I start on my far right with Emily Olson. Emily is the Chief Sustainability and Corporate Affairs Officer at Vale Base Metals. She brings more than 20 years of experience across global mining and energy companies, including senior roles at Freeport, BP, and began her career here in Washington on Capitol Hill. To my right is Frank Fannon. Frank is the co-founder and managing partner of Orion Critical Minerals Consortium. Some of you may recognize that as one of the public-private partnerships, which will therefore be called PPPs for the rest of this panel, and which between the DFC, the UAE, and Orion. He previously served as the inaugural Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources at the State Department during the first Trump administration, and is a senior advisor to us at the CSIS Critical Mineral Security Program. To my left is Tom Haslett. Tom is the acting managing director for critical minerals and energy policy at DFC, where he has led the agency's critical minerals work for the last 3 years. He brings more than 15 years of government experience focused on international policy. And to my far left is Sarah Whitten. Sarah is the senior vice president for the China and Transformational Export Program at the Export-Import Bank of the United States, EXIM, where she leads initiatives to support U.S. exporters in key sectors, including minerals, against global competition from the PRC. Prior to EXIM, Sarah spent over 15 years in roles at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency and in investment banking. So I like to think we have a lot of the best tools the U.S. government has to offer on a panel. Tom, I want to start with you. DFC it didn't start as a minerals financing institution, but it has increasingly had the burden of our international financing. What have been DFC's most significant contributions to advancing U.S. minerals diplomacy over the past year?
Thanks, Gracelyn, and thanks to CSIS for hosting this. You can't hear me. Let me see. How about now? Yes. Okay, great. So thanks to everybody. Thanks, Gracelyn, and thanks to CSIS for having me here today. DFC has had a pretty busy year as we've been working to pivot our approach in the critical minerals and other sectors to align with the Trump administration's points of emphasis in economic and national security spheres. So we have been both working behind the scenes to strengthen linkages with different parts of the U.S. government that are taking a leading role on the critical minerals supply chains front. So that includes organizations like EXIM that have introduced new tools. It also includes organizations like the Office of Strategic Capital that have increasingly played an important role in developing processing, midstream, and manufacturing capacity in the U.S. We've also continued to find ways to use our authorities to work in creative manners to address supply chain security issues overseas. And as you mentioned, DFC was not initially started as a critical minerals agency, but I think we've found ways to stretch our authorities and our investment products to help out with some of the particular gaps that these critical minerals projects often face overseas. So a few things that I'd point out over the past year are, number one, we have continued to find opportunities to work with private sector partners that can bring expertise and access to market that DFC would lack on its own. And I'm sure Frank will talk about this a little bit later, but we were able to approve earlier this year a $600 million investment with the Critical Minerals Consortium, which will draw on the expertise and capital of Orion, which is perhaps the premier private equity investor in the critical mineral space, although there are actually a number of different ways that they work, so I won't just say private equity. But in general, it's a way for us to expand our pipeline and have somebody who really knows what they're doing work the problem on behalf of the U.S. government. Furthermore, that was able to bring in another sovereign partner in the form of ADQ, which is a sovereign wealth fund from the UAE, which again is bringing capital from an international trade partner that can help us resolve constraints in the critical minerals supply chain. Beyond that, DFC has been, I think, in a good position to help center critical minerals as part of U.S. government diplomatic efforts, which is increasingly a focus of the Trump administration. So Gracelyn mentioned earlier the Ukraine situation, where DFC, in collaboration with the government of Ukraine, established an investment fund that will leverage the financial resources of both countries to help invest in reconstruction in Ukraine, drawing in the private sector into critical minerals, oil and gas, and infrastructure, while providing returns and then increasing supply chain security and trade linkages between the U.S. and Ukraine. In addition, DFC has been working closely with the State Department in the negotiation of a strategic partnership agreement with the DRC, which was announced about a week and a half ago, and where DFC also identified a couple of potential projects to get started, including as part of a joint venture, a PPP, if you will, between Mercuria, a commodities trader, and Gécamines, which is the state-owned enterprise that has oversight in the copper and cobalt sector in the DRC. So I think across the board, what you're seeing is DFC continuing to look for opportunities to be flexible and creative in how we deploy our capital, while aligning closely with U.S. foreign policy goals and supply chain security efforts for the U.S. and its international partners.
Thanks, Tom, and we'll come back to what reauthorization means and how that'll change what types of things you can do. Sarah, I want to come to you. This EXIM Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative, it was included also in one of President Trump's executive orders. How has it changed EXIM's ability to respond to critical minerals capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gracelyn. Thanks. And, you know, as a 91-year-old organization, we were created out of the Great Depression really just to spur jobs in the United States and support U.S. industry and U.S. exporters. And so we really sit as a financing agency at the nexus of domestic industrial policy and supporting global competition from a funding perspective. The way that we prioritize projects is really those that advance U.S. supply chain resiliency, enhance U.S. exports, and also crowd in private capital at the same time. So since our new chairman, Chairman Jovanovic, has joined, he's been incredibly clear to the market in terms of the 4 priorities of the bank going forward. And the first is back to basics. So essentially supporting as much U.S. exports going into the foreign projects that we support as much as possible. The second is in relation to energy dominance, and so supporting U.S. molecules going into the rest of the world as well as U.S. technologies. The third is supply chain resiliency. So this is very much linked to critical minerals, but it doesn't just mean critical minerals. It means any supply chain where we have ceded choke points and bottlenecks to other nations, which have negatively impacted the ability for U.S. industry to prosper. And finally, innovative technologies. And this includes things like artificial intelligence, where EXIM and DFC and others have been included in as financing agencies supporting the U.S. AI export stack. There's been other executive orders around nuclear, around drones. EXIM has been specifically listed on those types of executive orders to support financing for these industries as well. And so these are really the 4 areas that are of critical critical importance, and every single transaction that we do as EXIM has to link back to these strategic priorities. And as you can tell, all of the four areas also link back to critical minerals as well. So this is really important for us. But as Tom mentioned, where we come in from a funding perspective, our role is not to replace the market, but it's really to entice the market and private investors to come in. And so the way we see our function in transactions is to anchor bankability. And this is really important in sectors like mining, which is incredibly capital intensive. There's a lot of geopolitical risk involved, long lead times to development, and newer technologies which can deter commercial lenders. And so ultimately the way we pick these projects is, we need to weigh the strategic importance of these deals with the bankability of the transaction. So we look for things like very strong sponsors, credible offtake agreements, as well as alignment with US strategic objectives in order to ensure that we're getting as much private sector investment in these transactions as possible. And ultimately, I'll just make the point that, we are very focused on remaining good stewards of US taxpayer money. Every year, we're increasing the amount of money that we return back to Treasury. We've got actually quite a, I would say, conservative default rate cap that's been imposed on EXIM through our statutes. So everything that we do, we need to ensure that we lower the risk of our portfolio in our transactions. And the reason I mention that is that's just a helpful lens to think about how we're selecting our deals. So I just wanted to add that, and it's important for us and our underwriters to ensure that we're adhering to those metrics to ensure that we can continue as a sustainable entity within the US government toolkit.
Thanks, Sarah. Frank, there are many efforts titled public-private partnerships. What differentiates Orion's consortium model in practice? So governance, risk sharing, capital deployment from other mechanisms of financing that we've traditionally relied on.
Yeah, thank you. I guess firstly, the Orion Critical Minerals Consortium, so Orion Resource Partners, as Tom alluded to earlier, is the world's largest private capital provider focused on mining and metals, based in New York. It's an American group. Orion has been successful for a dozen years, and they're going to continue to do what they do. But what the Orion CMC, or Critical Minerals Consortium, is a mission-driven company, which Orion manages, but it's aligned with U.S. strategic imperative. It is a company to advance the U.S. and allied and partner nations' objective to secure critical minerals. That alone is a new thing. It's not just asking the U.S. government to come in and fund my existing business. It's creating something new, and so having the DFC as a cornerstone partner is a completely different approach. Having ADQ, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of the UAE, also jointly coming in is a different approach, and I think in terms of what is being invested in is that experience of Orion and the team. I mean, they built something like 80 mines in 35 jurisdictions over the last dozen years. That's a considerable amount of experience in using a variety of financial instruments across the capital stack to be kind of a leading player in this space. What we're focused on too is, the issue, and you're writing, Gracelyn, you spoke about this, the threat that America faces is now. It's not 20 years from now. And so what we've fashioned the CMC to do is targeting projects that are in production today or could be put in production within the next 2 or 3 years. That creates, that addresses this time horizon, this concern that we have, and because it takes 20 years to build a mine, it takes 3 years to build a processing or manufacturing facility. So by focusing on the mine and securing that metal, we could stand up the processing and refining and manufacturing solution to put that into some consumptive use, whether that refining and processing and manufacturing is in the United States or, again, in partner and allied nations. So that's kind of the thesis behind the Orion CMC. And having the U.S. as a key partner also increases the optionality for those kind of high value, big kind of targets that they're not all in OECD countries. So it's a meaningful de-risking mechanism And having all of the various partners, they also will get offtake and will manage that as a matter of course. But so it's a mission-driven company designed to address the concern for today, not just the one that may or may not become a mine in 20 years.
One follow-up question before I turn to Emily. Is the pool of mining and metals investors expanding?
It's always expanding, but the key is, are they aligned? Are they aligned with the mission set? I mean, there's lots of places you can go for money, but not everyone is going to demonstrate, and they're not going to agree to the same mission that is inherent into the CMC. So if they're not aligned in that way, then we'll go elsewhere for that financing. Again, this is, of course, we're going to realize this return, but it's to advance that imperative that the U.S. and allied nations have laid out very clearly.
Emily, as the only miner, at least on this stage, what does successful coordination look like between government and industry for both brownfield and greenfield projects? Because you're doing both.
Excellent question. We love a good greenfield, but really, I think as we look at the pace and the drive that governments globally want to unlock their mineral supply chain, you have to focus on brownfields as well. And so I work, many of you probably don't know Vale, but Vale is a large multinational owned by Brazilians, headquartered in Canada, operates in Indonesia and all parts of the world. And so when we think about how we can meet this demand and the need of every country, we supply 60% of superalloy nickel into the United States. We have been doing that since World War II. The U.S. is a really important market to us. As we think about demand from aerospace, defense, reindustrialization globally, being able to invest in brownfields, looking at how we extend the life of existing infrastructure and assets is really critical. Greenfields are also important, right? I have a huge greenfield pipeline in Brazil looking specifically at copper, and that will come over time. But as Frank just said, these things don't come very quickly, right? And so being able to prioritize our capital, to look at what we're doing. Mining, as much as we talk about mining, it's still a capital constrained industry, right? We still haven't come across that hurdle of many investors wanting to jump in right now, especially given the volatility in commodity prices. If you're in gold and copper, fantastic. Everybody else, hang in there. And so I think as we look at all of the tools and incentives, we've seen everything in the last few years here that tends to target the customer. That's fine. But for us, when we look at what's really going to get ore out of the ground to meet the needs of all of these growing supply chains globally, here in the US, Canada, the rest of the world, we need access to mine development cost. That's one of the largest costs that can constrain mines to move fast is mine development cost. Giving tax credits to consumers, fantastic, but don't forget us. We have to be able to move and embed that technology, move faster, right? And so I think for us, it's a pace conversation. The world isn't going to wait too long, right? We see the urgent demand for all of our commodities, be it rare earths, be it copper, be it, I'd like more demand for nickel. But again, it comes back to investing in the infrastructure you have, in the operations you do have, while in parallel looking at your greenfields. You need it, I come from the oil and gas, so you need all of the above, right? We can't be choosy on what we focus on, and I think ensuring government has tax incentives and regulation aligned to be able to look at how we push on our brownfield developments as well as greenfields. I think that will be a huge help.
Yeah, I think bringing that cost down and making these projects more cost competitive is a really core part of that. Tom, I want to come back to you. Critical minerals are inherently yet strategically vital. Where should DFC be prepared to take on more risk? Sarah, I'm coming to you with a very similar question next. And where should it maintain its guardrails?
Can I say we're going to do both all the time? I think the reality is that you're looking at a lot of different kinds of risk, and DFC inherently takes a certain type of risk that the private sector won't by investing in markets or in projects that are not as attractive to private capital on their own without some level of protection from the U.S. government or some sort of involvement from the U.S. government. And you see us taking that on in situations where we feel we can manage it better than the private sector. And so just as an example, we all like to talk about the fun stuff like a new project getting announced and so on and so forth. But I think the reality of developing and executing mining projects is sometimes maybe not as fun. And there's a lot of getting on the call with a U.S. ambassador in a country where the Ministry of Mines has not issued a required permit and asking for some lobbying to happen to help move that forward. And so that's the sort of risk where I think DFC feels like we have an opportunity to manage that risk effectively, and we'll lean in. In terms of market risk, there are situations where I think we need to lean in on having the aspiration for offtake agreements or for market to develop for a given mineral, even in the context of a little bit more uncertainty up front. The reason why that's particularly important in the mining sector is because it takes so long to develop new mines. So we are actively looking for brownfield or near-term opportunities that I think can help to meet demand for minerals today and relax some of the risk that we're seeing from Chinese trade practices, for example. But we also need to be looking further down the line. And in many cases, that is trying to support projects that don't have a market today. And so that includes things like taking on additional risk of non-binding offtake agreements because we want to make sure that they can sell to the U.S. So we could finance a mine where they would agree to sell all of the minerals to China, and we'd have ourselves a pretty good commercial project. But that's not the goal. And so can we lean in a little bit, take on a little bit more uncertainty around that? And then again, can we manage that through work with, for example, other parts of the US government, other countries, governments, and companies that we can access through our network to find opportunities to make those projects viable over time? The last point I'll mention is, there's certain types of risk that I think we'll continue not to take. You mentioned during your fireside with the congressman, the U.S. is known for bringing high standards to projects. And so we're going to continue to look for solid partners that have good reputations, that we feel like we can trust to do high quality work. We're going to look for projects that have high environmental and social standards because the U.S. taxpayer does not want to see its money applied to projects that are resulting in human rights abuses or environmental degradation. Frankly, the companies that we want to work with in the U.S., the auto manufacturers, the tech companies, and so on, don't want minerals that come from projects like that either. So those are the types of risks where I think we lean out a little bit and we either push for higher standards or we look for alternatives.
Thanks, Tom. Sarah, EXIM's mandate emphasizes credit discipline. Where should EXIM be willing to stretch and where should it not?
Well, thanks for asking the question about credit discipline because the banker in me can't resist talking about that. Earlier I had mentioned that we had come out with this new financing mechanism, the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative, which really opened the floodgates in terms of demand for EXIM financing, where previously our international financing tools were very much focused and linked to US inputs into a project. This tool allowed us to support projects that are sending offtake to the United States for feedstock into these strategic industries. And so because of that flexibility, the universe of transactions that we could look at just expanded exponentially overnight. We started getting approached by many junior miners, many sort of deals of varying sizes across all geographies, also because we're able to support deals both in the public and private sector in emerging and developed markets. And so really the world is our oyster in many ways, but it means that we need to have a framework in terms of how we view these transactions. So to answer your question, I think our role is really to stretch on the structuring of the deal and provide patient capital into these transactions, but not on credit fundamentals. We need to have flexibility around, let's say things like tenors or repayment holidays or phased disbursements or amortization schedules, risk sharing with other equity providers or other government agencies. And this is really important for the project to remain commercially viable and to receive attractively priced financing. Because again, when we're talking about what we're up against, cheap capital is one of the key pillars of bringing down an overall cost of a project when we're talking about Chinese developers, for example. But what we should not what we really should not give up on and really need to stay laser focused on is things like sponsor quality, experience of developing these types of assets, ensuring clarity of governance, clarity of the shareholding entities involved, where these offtake is going, things like FIOC and CSIS. These are all really important considerations for us to ensure that indeed the projects that we support are Western aligned, are of high quality, are able to withstand the test of time. And of course, we are looking for those that are looking to come into production in the near future. So those that have done a lot of the heavy lifting already to get to that point. These are the types of transactions that we look for. But, in the conversation earlier, somebody mentioned something about gold and copper projects. I mean, these are heavily traded, very liquid commodities available in abundance. Our ability to support those types of transactions, you can have a much more bankable transaction in these types of commodities. If you look at something like rare earths or more niche critical minerals, the problem set is inherently completely different. And if you look at sort of the financing and structuring considerations around something like rare earths, I mean, we're kind of building the airplane as we fly it in many ways. I mean, this is a new industry that we're looking to re-onshore back to the United States. And we can't be asking for things like 10-year offtake agreements when those refining and midstream operations are being built as we speak. So, these are some of the strategic considerations that we need to be very creative. We need to be clear-eyed rather, in our ability to understand that these are going to be challenges going into these transactions. And, to the best of our ability, understanding the sector and being able to structure and mitigate these risks as much as possible is what we are very focused on at Exim.
Thanks, Sarah. Frank, mining projects don't fail for lack of interest. They tend to fail on risk. Which risks is the Critical Minerals Consortium best positioned to absorb or mitigate in order to have that multiplier of private capital that we're aiming for?
Yeah, thank you. I'd first like to acknowledge what Sarah and Tom were speaking about, because I think it's pretty profound, and in that both Exim and DFC are retooling themselves based on the conditions that the world is in, not trying to shoehorn in their policies that seems to not be very practical to the current conditions. And I think that's hard to do, having served in government, and they're doing it with a degree of nimbleness that's rare. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more of that on the reauthorization too, Tom. But I think that in terms of the risk, the world has lots of good rocks. It's what is above them that's going to determine whether it's an investable opportunity or not, in many instances. And so I would say we continue to follow. So there's the two types of risks that I think are particularly relevant would be political risk, of course, and that political risk I describe is pretty broad. It could be all kinds of elements of above the ground risk, and then certainly operational risk in terms of the right management teams and making sure that things are done on time. The mining industry, by and large, on time and on budget, they build mines about 24% on time and on budget. It is horrendous. Orion has a history of doing it on time and on budget closer to the high 70s, 80%. And part of that is because of the distribution and milestoning of capital to assert a degree of operational oversight and control over a project. But that's tough to do. I mean, this is really, it's not like you just say, okay, here's some money, go get it. You need to really be on it and make sure that you select the right management team, and that goes back to workforce and people questions, and who are you going to back? And again, so I guess it's that large view of political risk and all of the elements of that, and having the U.S. government as well, depending on the country, the Emirati government being a co-investor helps to de-risk that in many instances, but then you fall back to that operational risk and finding the right team. But they're able to be mitigated, but it takes a lot of work.
Frank, how are you picking which project? You were in an era of market volatility right now. How is Orion thinking about which projects to pick in terms of what commodities we're focusing? I mean, the US government now has a list of about 60 critical minerals. And if I had to take my biggest takeaway from panel discussions today, it's like 60 minerals, very different markets, very different needs, very different capabilities. How do you pick how do you decide what you're prioritizing?
Well, firstly, that time horizon for development, that eliminates a lot of projects, right? And so then you start going into what is a scalable resource? What is, what's big, what's chunky, and and you start doing that. What are the logistics and all of the other infrastructure things around the mine that you can talk about? So those are all kind of the elements in terms of the prioritization. In terms of mineral selection, it's what everyone's talking about. Yes, there's 60 things. Some of those are tangential niche minerals that are produced coincident to something else that you're producing. So, but it changes the economics of that production. But I would say it's what everyone else is talking about too. We're not unique in that. One of the things that we are unique in is, and I think Sarah made the distinction between rare earths and big liquid base metals like copper. In terms of notionally you can create a vertically integrated supply chain with a company with something that's a small market. But as you scale up, it's virtually impossible to create a true integrated company that can do everything. So we're thinking about it in terms of, a virtual integration via deployment of capital across that supply chain. So back to the site selection, the mineral selection, what are we going to invest in? We're not going to invest in something that might be a good project, but we cannot identify a processing solution outside of China. That has to be part of it, is throughout. So even if we haven't built it here in the United States or elsewhere, can we ramp that processing, refining up, and do we have an immediate refining solution ex-China?
Yeah, vertical integration from the outset is a really important step. We sometimes think about vertical integration afterwards, and then we end up sending minerals to China for a while. Emily, I want to come back to you. I mean, this administration has really doubled down on the Western Hemisphere. What is the role of the Western Hemisphere in diversifying supply chain for some of the key minerals that we're talking about now?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like I said, we have massive endowment headquartered in Canada. So I call Toronto home these days. It's very cold. And then when you look at assets in Brazil, right? So I'll speak to my own portfolio. I think there's incredible opportunity there to recalibrate the supply chain, but compel partnership. We've talked about partnership a lot today. But when you look at, again, I go back to pace and urgency. We've set out on creating foreign policy, trade policy, governments, the Canadian government just unleashed its budget as well, which is very much tailored to incentives for mining, right? And so you're seeing this all over the world, just like you have here in the US. And so how we're thinking about that integrated supply chain, right? I'm an hour flight away, and ample endowment. The Canadian mining ecosystem has been there for a very long time, and it's much more hospitable at times to permitting and building mines. I think Seth from Glencore mentioned earlier, in all of North America, in the Western supply here, we have 3 copper smelters. 2 in the US, 1 in Canada. The Chinese have 200. And so when we think about our geography, our infrastructure, and how we're capitalizing on that, I think that is a really important opportunity as we think about the pace in which we need to deliver to a defense or a reindustrialization here in the US. We have strong endowments. We have strong existing partnerships. How do we, I don't want to build new infrastructure. I don't think anybody does. So how are we looking at that shared infrastructure space? How can we bring mines online faster? But really it becomes down to that refining and processing. I am a benefit of a vertically integrated, but equally, when you look at the Asia market, right? And I'll give nickel, class 1 nickel, super alloys. But class 1 nickel, 60% of that supply comes from Indonesia. 77% of it is refined in Indonesia. So, again, how are we thinking about this as Western suppliers to really, take advantage of each other's incentives in the toolbox? And I think there is an opportunity, right, to move faster and at scale. I have your basic base metals, copper, nickel, cobalt, but when you think about the rare earths over the border here in the US, right, we have an opportunity to think differently. And don't forget the Americas, right? You have an emerging market. I have a large copper endowment in Brazil, and that requires partnership. We've talked to the US, we've talked to many governments, right, about how we're thinking about what that market is, how we're thinking about partnership differently. I look at where we see, if you just take basic assumptions of AI and infrastructure demand, I think we've talked about data centers and AI for a long time now, but when you start to think about that from a copper perspective and you see a deficit moving into the next 24 months, we need to compel ourselves as a sector and as governments, right? Because in the mining sector, to think about partnership differently. Miners, we're fairly linear, but thinking about partnership in a different way and seeing what the U.S. has done with MP Materials and others, and the Canadians have taken some great steps too in thinking about how to do things differently. If we don't, I think we will lose the momentum behind what we're doing right now. And I think the Western supply chain and Western miners, we have a lot to do together through integration.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. It's like when I think about Vale, it's like there would be no General Motors parts without Vale. It's so vertically integrated with our economies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tom, I want to come to you. What does the reauthorized DFC look like, and how is it better fit to meet our mineral security needs going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are excited and hopeful that reauthorization will be at long last complete with the passage of the NDAA, which I hope will happen before the end of the year. And so I think if you're looking at what that's going to do for us, number one, I hope it means that we get a lot busier. We're going to ideally have a significantly higher maximum contingent liability, so up to $205 billion, up from 60 right now. So that gives us a lot of room to run. And I think that could mean both more transactions, or it could mean larger, more impactful, and more strategic transactions with sort of higher tickets. That includes in particular around equity, where we've been more constrained in the past, but are looking to get a $5 billion revolving equity fund, which would give us the ability to be a bit more strategic in our investments, take more direct stakes, and give more influence to the U.S. government in sectors like the critical minerals, where there's a strategic rationale for doing so. And then I think you're going to look at the expansion of the markets where we can work. Now, some of those are going to be markets that have been on the cusp for us historically. So a place like Chile, which has a great mineral endowment, but has been just over the high income line for us. But it also is going to free up our ability to work in markets that are, more traditional high-income countries, including, Five Eyes markets are called out specifically. And that could include, mining projects in some of the tier one jurisdictions like a Canada or an Australia. But I think we've also struggled quite a bit to find actionable opportunities for processing and midstream capacity in some of the lower income markets that we've historically been focused on. So could we find opportunities for processing and then help to do either direct or, as I think Frank said, virtual or sort of a synthetic integration where we can actually help to match up projects that we're working on overseas with those domestically. Ideally, I think we'd love to see some more staff. These projects are very difficult to underwrite and they're very difficult to monitor. We have to scale up our monitoring because these projects struggle not struggle, but they face environmental and social challenges. They face market challenges. And, not every project is a home run winner that never has any problems, and not every project is a failure. Most of them fall somewhere in between, and the success depends on people coming together to find solutions to challenges that they face along the way. So, I think we're also going to have to continue staffing up there. As you mentioned, we're not built for critical minerals investments, and there are different challenges. So we're learning to do the part that comes after the contracts are signed and the project is built as well, which is just as important to actually seeing the result, which is minerals flowing to the U.S.
And Tom, how do you see this? How do you see the reauthorized DFC moving the needle in complex jurisdictions, DRC, Ukraine. These are hard places.
Yeah. I mean, I think historically DFC has been the entity that does hard projects in hard places. We haven't really shied away from any market. We have, we've struggled a bit to find actionable projects in different places. But I think if you look at a place like Ukraine, a place like the DRC, one of the things we're doing differently there is we're not just kind of picking and choosing individual projects, but we're creating mechanisms that allow for more deeper integration. And so, as I mentioned, if the risks in a place like the DRC are around not whether the laws that are on the books are attractive to mining, but how those laws are actually applied, having a closer working relationship through something like the Joint Strategic Committee that's outlined in the Strategic Partnership Agreement that was recently announced is a way to ensure that U.S. Government officials can advocate directly on behalf of projects that are important to us, so that as there are potential challenges, the Chinese now, they can call up somebody, they know who to call up. Sometimes that comes with maybe a bag of cash or something. That's not how we're going to handle it, but we want to be, we want to be in direct connection with the people who are making decisions in these markets so that we can help to smooth over challenges and hopefully improve the investment environment to bring in companies that are of the quality and the caliber and aligned with our goals that we want to see. So I think it's both, continuing to work in the ways that we always have, as well as finding new institutional arrangements that help bring us closer to the decision makers in those countries on a regular and consistent basis.
Thanks, Tom. Sarah, how are you prioritizing projects right now? Is it by commodity? Is it by jurisdiction? We see a lot of companies out there, especially junior miners, looking for capital, but how are you prioritizing it from your side?
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to some of the areas that we were talking about earlier in regards to looking at the overall portfolio from a portfolio risk perspective and balancing the risks from that perspective. We've got pretty much every single one of our long-term underwriters working on a critical minerals transaction right now. Not all of them are niche critical minerals, but that's because we have to understand that the credit risk of the more liquid ones will outweigh the credit risk of some of the more national security linked yet more riskier transactions. And that's really important for us. But the other point that I wanted to maybe just dovetail on what Tom was talking about in your question to him is in regards to timelines. I mean, where some of the Chinese financing agencies move incredibly quickly in terms of getting term sheets across the line and things like that to potential project sponsors, this is something that we should be looking to improve internally on our side as well. And so from our perspective, we need to understand our existing toolkit, what our constraints are, and what we can unblock to get to that speed of execution while being prudent on from a financing and risk perspective. So what does that mean? Well, as EXIM, we've got a workforce of about a couple hundred people in comparison to some of our sister U.S. government agencies with tens of thousands of people, both domestically and internationally. So, when we get inquiries from embassies and things like that, we look at them with due care, but we have to be very clear to the market in terms of what we can actually deliver based on our existing workforce and our footprint. And so one of the ways that we're looking to change this, and this has been a focus of mine this year, and it's really accelerated in the last couple of months, is streamlining coordination internally. So we've now essentially merged our origination functions, where we've had a separate program for strategic sectors and a separate program for business development and regional coverage. That's all under one umbrella that I lead, working very closely with the head of the underwriting team to ensure that that passing of the baton is happening seamlessly through our internal life cycle, removing barriers to internal approval processes. These are the sorts of things that are really a focus, but also to triage transactions earlier rather than later. So, there's this thing called a letter of interest that EXIM can provide to potential borrowers who are interested. We've now started looking at them from a slightly different lens to say, perhaps we need to be more judicious in the types of letters of interest that we issue, because once that's out there, there's an expectation that's created that within a certain time frame, we would be able to execute, approve, and disperse under that transaction. And so given some of the constraints that I just mentioned, we just want to right-size market expectations, focus on the ones that are already in-house, and accelerate those towards disbursement so that the borrowers can have a check in their hands sooner rather than later. And this has been a huge huge focus for us. Partnership, I'll just mention one last thing on that point, is also helping us achieve this. So, we had a couple of transactions that we announced under the state visit partnership with Australia, for example. And one of the key areas of partnership there is we were working very, very closely with our equivalent in Australia, which is Export Finance Australia. They've got boots on the ground. They're a market that's GDP is primarily driven by mining-related industries, and so they've got technical expertise. They've done many mining deals in their transaction in their portfolio, so we should be leveraging that. And that's exactly the types of partnerships that we're talking about, not just other export finance agencies, but also commercial banks that have similar in-house information, so that we're not starting from scratch when we're looking at a transaction, and we're really utilizing everything that's available out there to move quickly and at pace.
Thanks, Erin. You guys have picked up a lot of speed this year. Both of you have picked up quite a bit of speed. Emily, I want to come to you. Financing is one piece of the puzzle about what we can offer projects and countries. But what is a better model of doing business and benefit sharing with communities? Because ultimately, if we're countering Chinese investment, countries have an option of who they work with. We as the US, how do we bring that better model?
So I think you start with jobs, right? I mean, if you want to run contrary to a Chinese approach to investment, we see this a lot in Asia, where you invest in big projects and you bring Chinese workforce in to do Chinese projects, and then you do not have the benefit of developing and building that local economy. So really thinking about that, right? I will tell you, in all my experience, ensuring that job creation piece is real. Will be very important. I mean, it all ties, right? Like, we're all in Washington. We know the political constituency and how that works. But I think that what I would note, that what has changed over the last several years, and probably it's been trending that way for the last few decades, is this role of equity. In particularly Western Hemisphere countries, Canada, the US, you're starting to see it now in Latin America, is this expectation for equity. When you look at mine development and new mines coming on, part of our success here is that we've brought to the forefront the attention of the mining sector, which I feel has been neglected for many years in the public policy space. But with that, we have to also change how we're approaching our communities. This isn't like 1995 CSR, I'm going to write Frank a check and he'll be happy. It's really,
Might be.
I would, maybe. I'll think about it.
How much?
Depends. But really thinking about what that equity and that value creation means for those communities. And I will tell you, the thing that when I look at all of our major projects over the last few years in all the companies I've been with, understanding first, before you start this, before you go down the road of development, what is the expectation of that community? What is the demographic? What is the jobs you've said you were going to create versus what you are, right? Really having a handle and going at it in we're back to partnership, but it has to be, right? It's changed, and this demand for equity and participation in mining projects, that is the new forward, right? We need to really think about that as mining companies, as we join with government and private equity to think about how we advance these projects at scale and at pace, is what that role of the community needs to be. And I fully believe in the right thing to do as a matter of trying to think through what that participation needs to look like. And it'll be different in different jurisdictions. I think the conversation in the Western Hemisphere, particularly Canada and the US, is more sophisticated. We've had more time, we have a more developed sector. But as you look at emerging economies, what that changing expectation is, for some, it's basic schools, infrastructure, investing in the communities. Others, it starts to become that participation, that shareholding. So I think really stepping back and adjusting how we think about communities and our engagement with them. It isn't something we do after we decide on the project. It should be the first thing. We've seen what's happened in Panama over this last year. We have every tool in the toolbox, so to speak, cliche, to engage with people. That's what people want: jobs. They want to see growth, and they want to see the positive in a mine. And we have to bring the positive to the mine site, right? And I think myself, you heard from my colleagues in other parts of the sector earlier today, it's just a real opportunity, but it's a necessity, right? We have to rethink how we bring people to the table when we want to develop so many mines.
Absolutely, and it adds a lot of durability to these solutions. A big theme today is how do we think about these solutions as becoming more durable politically, socially, economically, and it's a core part of that. So my final question, which I want to 30 seconds to each of you in the interest of time before we turn to get a State Department perspective on this exact issue, is 2026 when we look at how to keep momentum and how to continue getting rubber to hit the road, not just talking shop. Because in minerals diplomacy, we can sometimes get very good at talking, right? To get rubber to hit the road. One recommendation about how to continue this momentum.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say speed to execution, and Sarah certainly spoke to this, is absolutely critical. We have to move at the speed of business, and secondly, China's not sitting still watching America get its act together and starting to have a countermeasure. They're increasing their activity every day, and we need to keep pace.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I guess what I would say is, continuing to engage in partnership with our international partners as well as in the U.S. with regards to identifying market solutions that are going to make it a little bit easier to make these projects work. And so whether that be something like, standards-based marketplaces, pricing mechanisms, and so on, I think we need to continue finding ways to build up the mid and downstream capacity that will actually help drive success in this space.
From our perspective, we're already seeing enthusiasm around how, given ourselves and DFC and other U.S. government agencies focusing on some of the more harder to support strategic sectors, we're already seeing private sector players like Orion and CMC, as well as JP Morgan's $1.5 trillion security and resiliency initiative being announced and capital starting to deploy under these initiatives. And so it's already starting. I would just say let's keep up the momentum between public and private sector in this front. Success to me would that we exponentially increase the amount of authorizations and disbursements that go into the critical mineral sector under XM. But ultimately, it's just not about cutting the checks. It's also about building these projects and the impact that'll have on the supply chains and jobs in the United States. So we're really looking forward to that.
So capital deployed would be fantastic. How we see FIDs. We've talked about all of these projects, but what gets brought to that final investment case, right? Let's put these projects into motion. And really, for me, success would be looking at how we use our allies and our existing partnerships to move faster and stronger. I think diversification will come, but we have a built-in infrastructure and network already, so how are we going to capitalize on that while deploying that capital, while executing those projects? We don't have to make it harder for ourselves than it is.
Building relationships with new partners, rekindling old relationships, it's all kind of part of the equation. Well, please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Eric Paloma, to moderate our next conversation with Reggie Singh from the State Department.